They thought they could outsmart me and take it all. But one secret recording ruined everything. I found out about the will the way people learn most life-altering news in my family, by accident, in a quiet room that suddenly felt too small. My mother had left a yellow legal pad on the dining table, the kind she uses for grocery lists and holiday menus. Only this time the headings weren't cranberries and pie crust, but dates, attorney names, and a tidy bullet underlined twice. Finalize estate plan this quarter. The words sat there like a loaded trap. Harmless until you stepped exactly where they wanted you. I stood over the pad longer than I should have, counting the grooves her pen had pressed into the paper, listening to the grandfather clock chew through the afternoon. My parents had talked about getting their affairs in order for years, in the abstract and good-natured way people talk about repainting the shutters. But this wasn't idle talk. There were appointments. There was a timeline. There was, whether anyone said it out loud or not, a decision about who would inherit the house that raised us. The lake cabin with its cedar smell and crooked dock. The investment accounts my father tracked like migrating birds. In a fairer version of my life. That discovery would have made me sentimental. I would have pictured my mother labeling photo albums, my father sorting his fishing lures, both of them trying to make the mess of love and property neat enough to hand to their children. Instead, I felt a different current slide under my feet, something colder and more practical, like a lift from an unseen tide. Because in that same week, my sister had become omnipresent in the house again, efficient and luminous, as if auditioning for a role she knew she would get. She stocked the pantry with the exact herb tea our mother likes after dinner. She refolded towels into perfect thirds. She corrected the thermostat at the same minute every evening, the precise degree my father prefers when the news comes on. She moved through their routines with a grace that looked natural only if you didn't know her. I knew her. My best friend seemed to have discovered a sudden vocation for family. He had always been welcome, had grown up beside us on driveways and basketball courts, but lately he had turned into an auxiliary son. He changed light bulbs without being asked. He carried toolboxes with the reverence of a pallbearer. He laughed at my father's old stories in the exact beats my brother and I had learned to supply when we were boys. When my mother reached for her reading glasses, they were already in his hand. The choreography was so polished I could feel myself being written out of it that I told myself I was imagining it. Paranoia isn't a character trait I admire, and I've seen what it does to families. But the pattern held. My sister and my best friend began sharing little looks that were too brief to accuse and too practiced to ignore, the kind of glances people trade when they're inventorying a plan already in motion. They started arriving together by coincidence, leaving together because it's on the way, filling the house with a kind of static that made me aware of my own silence. If I tried to help, one of them was already there, reaching, reassuring, performing competency before I could find the right drawer. By the time I realized the legal pad had been placed exactly where a curious son might find it. I'd already taken the bait. It wasn't that I thought my parents loved me less. Love isn't the currency of wills. Narratives are. The story my sister and my best friend were building, of reliability, proximity, gentle sacrifice, was the kind that reads well under fluorescent lights in an attorney's office. And suddenly, I could see the outline of a future where the house on Maple Street. The cabin that smells like rain even when it's dry, and the accounts that could have made my own life broader, slid across a conference table to anyone who wasn't me. I wish I could say I confronted them then, that I stood in the kitchen and spoke the truth into the room until it rang like good crystal. What I did instead was smaller and more dangerous. I watched. I learned the tempo of their kindness. I measured the gap between assistance and performance. I noted how often my parents said the phrase, "We couldn't manage without you too," and how quickly my name failed to appear at the end of it. I told myself I was gathering facts, not sharpening resentments. But resentment is a patient tool. It hones itself while you sleep. The thing about a will is that it changes people before it changes anything. It makes every casserole a credential, every errand an exhibit, every smile an affidavit. And once you see that, you can't unsee it. That was the day my family home stopped being only a house and became a prize. That was the day my sister and my best friend stopped being only themselves and became a team. And that was the day I understood that if there was a game being played, I had already missed the opening move. The more I paid attention, the clearer the pattern became. My sister had always been clever, but now her cleverness had a new sharpness, like a knife honed for a particular task. She started keeping a small notebook, the kind that looked innocent enough with its floral cover, but she treated it with a reverence I recognized. It wasn't just grocery lists in there, it was documentation. Every doctor's appointment she scheduled for mom, every errand she ran for dad, every little thing she did that made their lives smoother, she wrote it all down. Almost like she was preparing exhibits for some invisible courtroom, a record to be presented when the time was right. And my best friend, God, that was the part that cut deepest. He'd been like a brother to me since we were kids, and now he was acting as if he was one. He'd slip in references to our family, in conversations with my parents, always just casual enough to be brushed off, but frequent enough to sink roots. My father especially seemed to warm to him. They'd sit in the den, voices low, heads bent toward each other in that intimate way that says trust has been earned, not borrowed. I would pass by the doorway and feel like an intruder in my own home. What made it unbearable was the subtle exclusion. Not outright hostility. No, they were smarter than that. It was the thousand small omissions. Family dinners where my sister would suddenly remember a story about how much help my friend had been fixing the garden shed, and I'd find myself chewing in silence while my parents' faces lit with pride. Afternoons when I'd arrive only to hear, "Oh, we already took care of that," as if my usefulness had been erased before I even stepped through the door. But the moment that shifted my suspicion into certainty came one Saturday morning. I dropped by earlier than usual, and as I walked up the front steps, I saw through the window my sister and my best friend in the kitchen, leaning close over the same yellow legal pad I discovered weeks before. Their heads nearly touched, their voices too low to hear, but their expressions, God, I'll never forget. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't affection. It was calculation. Two people rehearsing a script. They noticed me before I could slip away, and in an instant, the mask was back on. Smiles, greetings, the kind of casual warmth that could convince anyone nothing was amiss. But I knew. My stomach twisted with the realization. They weren't just supporting my parents out of love or duty. They were building a case, systematically, deliberately, designed to edge me out when the will was finally signed that I wanted to storm in, accuse them both of scheming, demand answers. But something in me held back. Because if they were playing a long game, the kind that relied on subtlety and performance, then the last thing I could do was give them an emotional outburst to use against me. I needed patience. I needed proof. I needed to become what I'd never been in this family drama. The one watching from the shadows instead of always standing in the light. I bit down on the fury, forced my face into neutrality, and joined them at the table as if I hadn't seen the truth reflected in their conspiratorial posture. I smiled. I nodded. I let them think I was blind. Inside, though, a single thought burned like a match pressed against my skin. If they wanted a game, I'd play. But not by their rules. From that day forward, I became an observer in my own family. Every visit, every phone call, every subtle glance between my sister and my best friend, I cataloged it all. It felt unnatural at first, forcing myself to be quiet, to swallow my instincts to defend myself, or to call out the manipulation I knew was happening. But I realized quickly that silence was my greatest weapon, and the more I watched, the more undeniable the pattern became. My sister started dropping comments that painted me as unreliable. She never attacked me directly. It was always framed as concern. "Oh, you know how busy he is with work. He probably won't have time for this." Or, "He's always so stressed lately. Maybe it's better if someone else handles it." At first, my parents brushed those remarks aside, but over time, I saw the seeds take root. Their responses shifted from, "That's not true," to, "Well, maybe you're right." My best friend played his part just as smoothly. He inserted himself into my father's projects, offering to help fix the leaky faucet, patch up the garage roof, even manage bills online. Dad, who had always been fiercely independent, suddenly began to rely on him. And Mom, she adored the way he showed up with flowers or small treats, gestures I realized weren't random but calculated. He was building an image, one act of devotion at a time, all while I was subtly cast as distant. The cruelest part was how natural they made it seem. To anyone outside, it looked like they were just being thoughtful, kind, responsible. If I had tried to explain what I saw, I would have sounded paranoid. They're helping too much. Can you imagine how ridiculous that would sound? One night, though, I overheard something that made my blood run cold. I had come by late, thinking I'd catch Dad before bed, but as I walked down the hall toward the kitchen, I heard hushed voices. My sister and my best friend again, their tones serious. I froze. Once they finalized the will, it's too late for him to argue, my sister whispered. He won't even see it coming, my friend replied. His voice low, almost smug. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might give me away. I backed away from the doorway, hands trembling, and forced myself out of the house before I could hear another word. That was the confirmation I'd been waiting for. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't imagination. They were planning, plotting, aligning themselves to make sure when the ink dried on that paper, my name meant nothing. I drove home in a haze that night, my mind racing. Rage pulsed through me, but beneath it was something sharper, clarity. They thought I was blind, complacent, easy to edge out. They thought they could write me out of my own family without me even noticing. But now that I knew their game, I had a choice: confront them and risk being painted as unstable, or outplay them in silence. And as much as every fiber of me wanted to scream, I knew one thing with certainty. If I wanted to protect what was mine, I'd have to become as calculating as they were. Maybe even more. In the days that followed, I played my role to perfection. On the surface, I was the same old me, smiling at family dinners, cracking jokes, helping my parents carry groceries inside. But beneath the surface, I was sharper, more watchful. Every movement of my sister, every act of devotion from my so-called best friend, I logged in my mind like evidence. It became clear that they weren't just cozying up to my parents. They were rewriting the family story. Subtly, they began to portray me as the unreliable one. My sister would mention how I missed a family gathering, carefully leaving out that she'd forgotten to tell me about it until the last minute. My friend would sigh sympathetically and say, "He's just under a lot of pressure right now," as though he was covering for me. It was brilliant in its cruelty, making me look like a flake while he looked like the loyal son my parents never had. The betrayal gnawed at me in quiet moments. I'd lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how my own blood and my closest friend could conspire against me. It wasn't just about money. It was about legacy, trust, and love. They weren't just trying to take the inheritance. They were trying to erase me from the family portrait, but anger alone wasn't enough. I needed proof. Something undeniable that couldn't be twisted into paranoia or bitterness. So I started watching more carefully, listening when I wasn't supposed to. And then, one evening, I found the first crack in their plan. I'd stopped by my parents' house unannounced, claiming I had extra groceries I didn't want to go to waste. My sister was already there, sitting at the kitchen table with my best friend, a stack of papers spread before them. The moment they saw me, she slammed the folder shut, and he forced a casual smile. It was too late. I'd already seen the heading on one of the documents. A legal firm's letterhead. I didn't say anything. Not then. I just carried the groceries in, chatted with Mom, and left as though nothing was unusual. But inside, I felt the ground shift. They weren't just scheming in whispers anymore. They were moving forward, putting their plan into action. The realization hit me like ice water. I wasn't just running out of time. I might already be too late. That night, I made myself a promise. If they wanted to play dirty, I'd have to get smarter, sharper, and colder. They thought they could blindside me, but I wasn't going to sit back and let them bury me alive. And as I lay in bed, wide awake, the weight of it all crushing me, I realized something else. If I wanted to expose them, I'd have to risk everything, even my parents' trust, to bring the truth to light. The question was how? From that night on, everything became a chessboard. Every conversation, every family gathering, every phone call was another move to observe and counter. I started noting down dates and times. When my sister visited our parents, when my friend dropped by just to help with chores. Patterns began to emerge. They were always together when I wasn't there. They'd forget to tell me about important meetings with the family lawyer. They were slowly rewriting my image, planting the idea that I wasn't responsible enough, that maybe I didn't even deserve what my parents were planning to leave us. I didn't confront them directly. That would only tip my hand. Instead, I played the part of the slightly oblivious brother and the distracted friend. Meanwhile, I started collecting everything: text messages, bank records, any scrap of evidence that hinted at the truth. Then I did something bold. I reached out to the family lawyer myself. Casually. I didn't demand to see anything, just asked how my parents were structuring things. The lawyer, professional as ever, didn't share details. But his hesitation was telling. He paused for a moment too long before saying he couldn't disclose anything. I left that meeting with my suspicions confirmed. My sister and my so-called best friend were not only pushing to be named in the will, they were pushing me out entirely. The more I thought about it, the more brilliant their plan seemed. My sister would inherit as the dutiful daughter who stayed close to home. My best friend, who'd become almost like a surrogate son, would be named in some other capacity, maybe as an executor, maybe as a beneficiary for his loyalty. And me? The absent, unreliable brother? I'd be cut out. It was working, too. My parents had started dropping little comments about how grateful they were to my sister and my friend for always being there. They looked at me with that mix of concern and disappointment that cuts deeper than anger. I had to move fast, but every time I tried to picture how to expose them, I hit a wall. If I accused them without hard proof, it would look like bitterness. If I told my parents directly, they'd think I was trying to poison the well before the will was written. I needed something undeniable. A crack in their performance so big it couldn't be explained away. And as the weeks went on, I realized the pressure on them was mounting, too. The closer they got to their goal, the more reckless they became. That's when I decided to bait the trap. I started hinting, casually, that I'd landed a big job out of state. That I'd be moving soon, far away. That I wasn't interested in family business anymore. I played the part of the careless brother who'd basically given up, and it worked. Their smiles grew a little too smug. Their whispers a little too careless. For the first time, I felt the balance shift. I didn't know how yet, but I was going to make them reveal themselves. And when they did, they'd have no way back. Once I'd planted the idea that I was moving away and no longer cared about family affairs, their guard began to drop. My sister's tone toward me shifted. She went from polite indifference to open condescension. My best friend stopped even pretending to include me in conversations about family matters. They started having secret meetings with my parents in broad daylight. Confident that I wasn't paying attention anymore, I stayed silent. But inside my thoughts were racing. I began to notice every little detail. The way my sister would always bring documents in a discreet folder when she visited our parents. The way my friend would offer to help them with finances. How their phone calls would abruptly stop when I entered a room. They weren't just manipulating my parents emotionally. They were also maneuvering legally. I realized I needed someone on the inside. Someone they wouldn't suspect. So I reached out to an old family friend, a retired accountant who had been close to my parents for years. Quietly, I told him what I suspected. He didn't say much at first, just nodded. But a week later, he confirmed what I feared. They were indeed trying to have my name removed from the will under the pretext of irresponsibility and lack of interest. That confirmation hit me like a thunderclap. But instead of anger, I felt clarity. Now I had a mission, not just to defend my share, but to show my parents who these people really were. I began to collect proof systematically. I recorded dates of meetings, noted down overheard phrases, kept screenshots of texts they accidentally sent me. I also set up a small camera in my parents' guest room when I knew my sister and friend would be visiting. Nothing illegal, just a simple device to record audio in case they got too comfortable talking behind closed doors. Meanwhile, I turned up the act. I started posting on social media about my big move and how I'm not interested in inheritance drama. I even went so far as to tell my parents that I didn't want them to worry about me financially. I had something huge coming. It worked better than I'd hoped. One evening, while I was out of town, my sister and my best friend met at my parents' house to finalize their pitch. They didn't know my parents had invited me over earlier that day for coffee, nor that I'd left my phone recording in my coat pocket hanging by the door. That recording turned out to be the crack I'd been waiting for. When I listened to it later that night, my hands shook. On it, my sister and my so-called friend were openly discussing how soon it'll all be ours, and how he'll be gone before he even knows what hit him. They even laughed about how gullible my parents were. It wasn't just a smoking gun, it was an entire arsenal. But I knew I couldn't just march in with the recording and accuse them. My parents loved them. This would shatter their image of their dutiful daughter and loyal family friend. If I handled it wrong, it would blow up in my face. So I devised one last move. I'd let them believe they'd won, let them stand before my parents in triumph, and then reveal the truth in a way that even they couldn't deny. This wasn't about revenge anymore. This was about truth. The day of the family meeting arrived sooner than I expected. My sister called, her voice dripping with fake warmth, inviting me to come over because we all needed to talk. I played dumb, pretending to be surprised but agreeable, and showed up right on time. When I walked into my parents' living room, the scene was already staged. My sister sat close to them, holding a stack of papers with neat little tabs sticking out. My best friend leaned casually against the fireplace, exuding false confidence, as if he were already part of the family by law. My parents looked serious but trusting, clearly influenced by the poison they had been fed. They didn't waste time. My sister started explaining how she and my friend had been stepping up to help with family responsibilities, unlike me, who was always busy with other things. My friend chimed in, talking about my reckless spending and lack of commitment, painting me as the unreliable one. Then my sister carefully slid the papers across the table, explaining that it was only logical for the inheritance to be restructured so that they would be the primary beneficiaries that I let them talk. I let them dig the hole deeper and deeper, nodding occasionally, even feigning a hint of guilt, which only encouraged them to push harder. By the time they finished, my parents were clearly swayed, disappointed in me, but ready to sign. That was the moment I had been waiting for. I leaned back in my chair, took a deep breath, and pulled out my phone. "Before we finalize anything," I said calmly, "there's something you should hear." I pressed play. The room went silent except for the cold, damning words of my sister and my supposed best friend, recorded without their knowledge. Their laughter about how gullible my parents were. Their smug promises of how everything would soon belong to them. Their blatant betrayal. It all filled the room like poison gas. My parents' expressions shifted from confusion to shock to horror. My mother's hand trembled as she reached for the papers on the table. My father looked like he had been struck with a hammer, staring first at my sister, then at my so-called friend, his face drained of all trust. For once, neither of them had anything to say. Their mouths opened, then closed again, like fish gasping for air. The power dynamic flipped in an instant. I wasn't the gullible one anymore. I wasn't the irresponsible child. I was the one who had seen through them, who had caught them red-handed. And in that silence, I knew. The game was over. My father was the first to break the silence. His voice was low, almost trembling, but every word landed with the weight of a hammer. He asked my sister if the voices on the recording were really hers. She didn't even try to deny it. Instead, she mumbled something about being misunderstood and only joking. My best friend looked pale, his usual charm gone, stammering excuses about how the conversation was taken out of context. But the damage was done. My parents weren't fools, not anymore. My mother's eyes filled with tears as she whispered that she couldn't believe her own daughter would conspire to rob her brother of his rightful place in the family. My father's disappointment was harsher. He slammed his hand on the table and told them both that trust, once broken, could never be repaired. I sat quietly, watching them unravel. For so long, I had been painted as the unreliable one, the outsider, the child who couldn't be counted on. But here they were, exposed as liars and manipulators. And all I had to do was show the truth. Then came the twist I didn't expect. My father picked up the inheritance papers and slowly tore them in half, his eyes never leaving my sister's. He said the will would remain unchanged. Everything would still be split equally, just as he and my mother had always planned. But then, with a heavy sigh, he added that they would also be putting strict conditions into place, proof of responsibility, transparency in finances, and, most importantly, complete exclusion of anyone outside the immediate family. That last part was directed squarely at my so-called best friend. My sister's face collapsed in despair, realizing she had not only failed, but had made things worse for herself. My friend, humiliated and cornered, stormed out without saying a word, slamming the door behind him. As for me, I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. The truth had done the work for me. Later that night, when I was alone, I felt the weight of everything sink in. I hadn't just exposed a scheme. I had lost a sister I thought I knew, and a best friend I thought I could trust. But maybe that was the price of clarity. Sometimes, to protect your future, You have to let go of the people who only wanted to destroy it. The inheritance was never really the point. It was about respect, trust, and loyalty. And in the end, those who tried to take it from me lost everything. Not because I fought dirty, but because the truth has a way of winning when it's finally brought into the light. Thank you for watching this story on True Tales Hub. Please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss our next story that we post new tales twice a day, and each one comes with unexpected twists you won't see coming.